A young surgeon threw away his career to save a stranger bleeding out on asphalt. 12 years later, 340 bikers surrounded his house at dawn, and what they did next, no one saw coming. For more stories like this, subscribe. The sound came first, low and distant, like thunder rolling across hills, except the sky over suburban Portland was clear and pale with early summer light. Dr. Ethan Cross woke to it at 6:47 in the morning, his hand reaching instinctively for his wife before his eyes opened. Sarah stirred beside him, 7 months pregnant, her breath catching as the rumble grew louder, closer, until the bedroom windows began to rattle in their frames. Ethan sat up. The noise was not thunder. It was engines, hundreds of them. He crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain. His street, usually empty at this hour except for joggers and newspaper deliveries, was lined end to end with motorcycles. Chrome and black leather, and men standing beside their bikes in formation, arms crossed, faces unreadable beneath the early light. The air smelled of motor oil and gasoline, sharp and metallic, cutting through the scent of morning dew on the grass. Ethan counted 20 bikes, then 30, then stopped counting. Sarah appeared at his shoulder, her hand gripping his arm. Her voice was small. "Ethan, what is this?" He did not answer because he did not know. His neighbors were emerging onto porches, phones already raised, recording. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez stood frozen on her front steps, her dog barking uselessly at the end of its leash. Someone would call the police. Someone probably already had. Then, as if obeying some silent command, every engine cut at once. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed against Ethan's chest, heavy and expectant. 340 men stood motionless in the sudden quiet, and not one of them looked away from his house. Sarah's grip tightened. "I'm calling 911. Wait." Ethan's eyes had caught on something. The lead bike, parked directly across from his driveway, was a 2009 Harley-Davidson Fat Boy, matte black with a dented chrome eagle emblem on the gas tank. He knew that dent. He had seen it before, years ago. Under circumstances he had spent a long time trying to forget. The man standing beside the bike was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. He wore a leather vest over a faded gray shirt, and the vest bore patches Ethan could not read from this distance. The man's eyes, pale and steady, were fixed on the house, not with threat, with something closer to patience. Ethan's heart was beating too fast. He turned from the window and moved toward the stairs. Sarah followed, her voice rising. "Ethan, don't open that door. I have to. You don't know what they want." He stopped on the landing and looked back at her. Her face was pale, one hand pressed protectively over her belly. He wanted to tell her it would be fine, but the words felt false, so he said nothing. He descended the stairs, crossed the living room, and opened the front door. The man with the scar was already at the end of the driveway, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped 5 feet from the porch, hands loose at his sides, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Up close, Ethan could see the patches on the vest more clearly. Iron Covenant MC, Portland chapter, established 1987. Below that, a smaller patch, sewn with care, in memory of Dmitry Hammer Constantine, 1975 to 2011. The man's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough but not unkind. "You don't remember me, Doc, but I remember you." Ethan's mouth was dry. "I don't understand." "No, you wouldn't." The man gestured toward the bikes, the men standing silent in the street. "My name's Victor Constantine. People call me Reaper. You saved my brother's life 12 years ago, June 14th, 2011. Highway 26, just past the Sylvan exit. You pulled over when no one else would." The memory came back in fragments. Blood on asphalt, a man's chest not rising, the weight of a pocket knife in his hand, and the desperate, impossible decision to cut into a stranger's throat because there was no other choice. Ethan's hands had shaken so badly afterward he could barely grip the steering wheel. "I remember," Ethan said quietly. "I remember stopping. I didn't know if he made it." Victor's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He made it. Lived another 10 years because of what you did. Met his daughter's husband, held his grandson, died in a hospital bed in 2011 with his family around him, not alone on a highway in the dirt. He paused. You gave us that, and the hospital fired you for it. Ethan looked past Victor, at the rows of bikers standing in formation, at the neighbors watching from their porches, at Sarah framed in the doorway behind him with fear written across her face. He looked back at Victor. Why are you here? Victor reached into his vest and pulled out a folded envelope, plain white, unsealed. He held it out. My brother's last words to me were, find the kid who saved me, make it right. Took us 12 years, but we found you. And today, we make it right. Ethan took the envelope. His hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in a long time. He opened it and saw the check inside, cashier's check made out to his name. $87,000. He stared at the number until it stopped making sense. When he looked up, Victor was watching him with the same patient, unreadable expression. I can't take this. You can. You will. Victor's voice was firm but not harsh. We know about the medical debt. We know about your wife. We know you've been working at a clinic in Park Rose for a third of what you should be making, because no hospital in this city would touch you after St. Vincent threw you away. He stepped closer, and his voice dropped. You gave up everything to save one of ours. Today, we pay you back. And Doc? He glanced toward the house, toward Sarah standing pale and shaking in the doorway. We're not done yet. 12 years earlier, Ethan Cross had been 22 years old and certain the world made sense. It was June 14, 2011, and he was driving east on Highway 26 toward Portland. His medical degree still new enough that he checked his reflection in the rearview mirror to make sure he looked like someone who belonged in a hospital. His first day as a surgical resident at St. Vincent was supposed to start at 8 in the morning. He had left his apartment at 6:30 to be early. The accident site appeared just past the Sylvan exit, where the highway curved through dense forest and the shoulder narrowed to gravel. A single motorcycle lay on its side, chrome scratched and smoking faintly in the cool morning air. The rider was 10 feet away, motionless. His helmet cracked and his left leg bent at an angle that made Ethan's stomach turn. There were no other vehicles, no witnesses, no one stopping. Ethan slowed, then hesitated. He was already running the calculations. If he stopped, he would be late. If he was late on his first day, it would follow him through his entire residency. But the man on the ground was not moving, and the highway stretched empty in both directions. He pulled onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence outside was broken only by the ticking of the motorcycle's cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic on the far side of the hill. Ethan grabbed the first aid kit from his trunk and ran. The rider was a man in his mid-30s, heavy-set, with a beard and a leather vest that read Iron Covenant across the back. His face was pale, lips blue, eyes half open and unseeing. Ethan dropped to his knees and pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. No pulse. He tilted the man's head back, checked his airway, blocked. Blood and mucus, maybe a broken jaw. His chest was not rising. Ethan's hands moved faster than his thoughts. He rolled the man onto his side, swept the airway clear, rolled him back. Still no breath. He started chest compressions, counting aloud. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The man's ribs flexed under his palms, and Ethan knew at least one of them had cracked, but he did not stop. After 3 cycles, the man still was not breathing on his own. Ethan sat back, breathing hard, and looked at the man's throat. The trachea was crushed or blocked, and without air, nothing else mattered. He had maybe 2 minutes before brain damage became irreversible. Ethan pulled his pocket knife from his jeans, flipped it open, and wiped the blade on his shirt. His hands were shaking. He had practiced this procedure on mannequins, cadavers, watched it done in controlled environments under supervision. He had never done it alone on the side of a highway with a stranger dying in front of him. He found the cricothyroid membrane by touch, made the incision, and inserted the hollow tube from a pen he had emptied and sterilized with hand sanitizer. Blood welled around the tube, but air moved through it, faint and rasping. The man's chest rose, fell, rose again. Ethan resumed compressions. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. His shoulders burned and his vision blurred with sweat, but the man's chest kept rising and falling, and finally, distantly, he heard sirens. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes after Ethan had started compressions. They took over without question, loaded the man onto a stretcher, and disappeared into the ambulance. One of them, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, paused before climbing in. "You bought him a chance. Maybe 5%, but that's 5 more than he had." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He stood on the side of the highway and watched the ambulance pull away, lights flashing. And then he got back in his car and drove to the hospital. He arrived 4 hours late, his shirt stiff with dried blood, his hands still trembling. Dr. Raymond Coulter, chief of surgery, met him in the hallway outside the residence lounge. Coulter was in his late 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who spoke softly and expected to be obeyed. He looked at Ethan's blood-stained clothes and said, "You're late." "I'm sorry. There was an accident. A motorcyclist. No pulse. I had to." "You stopped for a biker?" Coulter's voice did not rise, but the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. "Do you have any idea what that looks like? What kind of liability you've just exposed yourself to? This hospital to?" Ethan stared at him. He was dying. "He was not your patient. You are not licensed to practice emergency medicine on the side of the road. You're a first-year resident who has now made himself and this institution vulnerable to a lawsuit if anything goes wrong." Coulter stepped closer. "The man you saved is a member of a motorcycle gang. Do you understand what that means?" "It means he's a human being." Coulter's expression did not change. "It means you've made a mistake, and mistakes have consequences." The man Ethan had saved was named Dmitry Konstantin. He survived the surgery to repair his crushed leg and punctured lung. He spent 6 weeks in the ICU and another 3 months in rehabilitation. Ethan never met him. By the time Dmitry was stable enough for visitors, Ethan was gone. The hospital's administration had given him a choice: resign quietly or be reported to the state medical board for unauthorized intervention and reckless endangerment. His attending physician, Dr. Lena Ortiz, had fought for him, argued that he had acted within the scope of his training and saved a life. She was overruled. The hospital's legal team decided the optics were too risky. A first-year resident performing field surgery on a gang member was not the kind of story they wanted associated with St. Vincent. Ethan resigned. He kept his medical license, but the dream of becoming a surgeon died that day in Coulter's office. He took a position at a walk-in clinic in Parkrose, a neighborhood where no one asked questions and the pay was barely enough to cover his loans. He never knew if Dmitry Konstantin lived or died. He never tried to find out. Some part of him had not wanted to know. Now, standing in his driveway with Victor's words still ringing in his ears, Ethan understood what he had lost and what Dmitry had gained. 10 years, a daughter's wedding, a grandson's birth, a death surrounded by family instead of alone on asphalt. Victor pulled a photograph from his vest and handed it to Ethan. It showed a man in a hospital bed, older and thinner than Ethan remembered, holding a newborn baby and smiling. The man's eyes were tired but bright, and the people crowded around him, a young woman, a man in his 20s, Victor himself, were smiling too. "That's 3 days before he died," Victor said quietly. "Cancer got him in the end. But he got to hold his grandson first. He got to say goodbye." "You gave us that." Ethan's throat was tight. "I didn't know. I never knew if he made it. Now you do." Victor took the photograph back and tucked it carefully into his vest. "And now we make it right." 6 hours before Victor Constantine knocked on Ethan Cross's door, the Iron Covenant Clubhouse in North Portland was dark, except for a single light burning in the back room. The building sat on a corner lot behind a chain-link fence, a squat concrete structure with no windows facing the street, and a heavy steel door that opened only for members. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs of men on motorcycles, some smiling, some gone. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, scarred and stained from years of meetings, arguments, and reconciliations. Victor stood at the head of that table at 3 a.m, his phone in his hand, and typed a message into the group channel. "Church. Now, Dimitri's debt. The replies came within seconds. On my way, rolling out, be there in 10, 42 members of the Portland chapter, all awake or waking, all responding without question. Victor set the phone down and looked at the photograph pinned to the wall behind him. Dimitri, younger and grinning, one arm around Victor's shoulders, both of them covered in road dust and sunlight. The photo had been taken in 2006. 5 years before the accident that should have killed him. Victor made 3 more calls. Seattle chapter, Eugene, Boise. The conversations were short and identical. We're calling in the debt. Dimitri's doctor. We need numbers. Every chapter president said the same thing. How many do you need? Victor answered, as many as you can send. By 4 in the morning, the clubhouse was full. 42 men crowded into the main room, some sitting, most standing, all wearing their vests and waiting in silence. The air smelled of leather and cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic tang of motor oil that clung to everything in the building. Victor let the silence stretch, then spoke. 12 years ago, my brother died on Highway 26, except he didn't. A 22-year-old kid pulled over when no one else would, cut into his throat with a pocket knife, and brought him back. That kid lost everything because of it. The hospital fired him, destroyed his career. He's been paying for saving Dimitri's life ever since. No one interrupted. Victor placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed documents, financial records, medical bills. He had spent 2 weeks gathering them, calling in favors, pulling strings with people who owed the club debts of their own. His name is Ethan Cross. He's 34 now, works at a clinic in Park Rose, making a third of what he should. His wife is 7 months pregnant, high risk. They've got $87,000 in medical debt from a miscarriage 2 years ago that the insurance wouldn't cover. He wants to open a free clinic for kids who can't afford care. He's got the building. He's got nothing else. Victor looked around the room. Faces he had known for decades. Men who had stood beside him at funerals and weddings and hospital bedsides. Men who remembered Dimitri. Today we pay him back. Marcus Thompson, called Wrench by everyone who knew him, spoke first. He was in his 40s, black, built like a middleweight boxer, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails from years working as a mechanic. He had served 2 tours in Iraq and came back with a limp and a toolbox. I'm in. What do you need? Everything, Victor said. Money. Muscle. Connections. We're going to wipe his debt, fund his clinic, and fix what the hospital broke. Lila Vargas, known as Stitch, leaned forward. She was in her 30s, Latina, with dark eyes and steady hands that had stitched up more club members than she could count. She had been an ER nurse before burning out under administrators who cared more about billing codes than patients. She had joined the club 3 years ago and never looked back. If this is the same Ethan Cross I'm thinking of, he got screwed by Raymond Coulter at St. Vincent. Coulter's still there, still doing the same thing to other doctors. Victor nodded slowly. Then we're going to do more than pay Ethan back. We're going to take Coulter down. Connor Murphy, called Old School, was the oldest man in the room at 63. He had spent 30 years as a union organizer before retiring, and he still had a contact list that could move mountains if you knew how to ask. His voice was rough from decades of cigarettes and shouting over factory floors. I know people in the medical community, construction, legal. If you want to build something real, I can make calls. Make them, Victor said. Jasmine Chen, called Jazz, was the youngest in the room at 26. She had dropped out of MIT in her junior year after her brother overdosed on opioids prescribed by a doctor who got kickbacks from the manufacturer. She had joined the club because they were the only ones who did not treat her grief like a problem to be managed. She was also the best with computers Victor had ever seen. I can pull his financials, medical records, anything public. If Coulter's dirty, I can find it. Do it clean, Victor said. Nothing illegal. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Jazz nodded. I'll file Freedom of Information requests. Use credit transparency laws. It'll take a few days, but I'll get what we need. Victor placed both hands on the table. The room was silent again, waiting. He looked at each face in turn, then spoke the words that had been spoken in this room for 30 years. Every time the club committed to something that mattered. This isn't about muscle. This isn't about reputation. This is about making things right. Dmitri lived 10 extra years because of Ethan Cross. He met his daughter's husband. He held his grandson. He died whole. That's worth everything. Victor's voice dropped. Blood for blood, life for life. Are we agreed? One by one, every man in the room stood. They moved to the table and placed their right hands on the photograph of Dmitri, overlapping, a pile of calloused palms and scarred knuckles. No one spoke, but the weight of the moment pressed against the walls. Victor was the last to place his hand. We ride at 6:30, 340 bikes. We go to his house first, so he knows we're serious. Then we get to work. The meeting broke. Men filed out into the parking lot, pulling on gloves, checking tire pressure, making calls to chapters in other cities. Wrench started going through the garage, taking inventory of tools and supplies. Stitch pulled up hospital staff directories on her phone, looking for names she recognized. Connor stepped outside and started dialing, his voice low and urgent. Jazz sat in the corner with her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. By 6 in the morning, the count was final. 340 riders confirmed. Portland, Seattle, Eugene, Boise, Spokane, even a handful from Sacramento, who had ridden through the night. They assembled in the parking lot as the sky turned gray, engines idling, forming ranks without needing orders. Victor walked the line, checking faces, nodding to chapter presidents he had not seen in years. At 6:25, he climbed onto his bike, the 2009 Fat Boy with the dented eagle emblem. He looked back at the column of riders, stretching 2 blocks behind him, then forward at the empty street. He thought of Dmitri, of the last words his brother had said to him in the hospital, 3 days before the cancer finally won. Find the kid who saved me. Make it right. Victor started his engine. The sound rolled through the column like a wave, 340 motorcycles roaring to life in unison. He pulled out onto the street, and the river of chrome and Leah. There followed. The convoy moved through Portland like a thunderstorm given shape. 340 motorcycles in formation, riding 2 abreast down streets still wet with morning dew, past shuttered storefronts and houses where lights were just beginning to flicker on. The sound was immense, a rolling wave of engine noise that rattled windows and set off car alarms 3 blocks away. People stepped onto porches with coffee mugs in hand and phones already recording. The footage would be online within minutes, spreading across social media with captions that ranged from alarmed to awestruck. Victor led the column, his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the handlebars. Behind him rode the Portland chapter, then Seattle, then Eugene, the ranks organized by chapter and seniority without anyone needing to give orders. They had done this before, though never for a reason like this. The ride was legal. Connor had filed a parade permit 3 days earlier, under the name of a veterans charity the club supported, and 2 police motorcycles flanked the convoy at a respectful distance, lights flashing but silent. By the time they reached Ethan's street in the suburbs, the sun had risen enough to cast long shadows across the asphalt. Victor raised his left hand, and the column slowed, then stopped. Engines idled for 10 seconds, then cut in perfect unison. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Victor dismounted and walked alone toward the house. The protocol was clear: never swarm, never overwhelm. One voice, one message, delivered with respect. He saw the curtain move in the upstairs window, saw a man's face appear briefly before disappearing again. Good. Let him see. Let him understand this was not a threat. The front door opened before Victor reached the porch. Ethan Cross stood in the doorway, barefoot. Wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and fear. Behind him, a woman appeared, pregnant, her hand gripping his arm. Victor stopped 5 feet from the steps and met Ethan's eyes. The conversation that followed was short. Victor explained who he was, what Ethan had done, what it had cost him. He handed over the envelope with the check inside, $87,000, raised from 42 members in 3 days. Some had given $100, some had given $5,000. No one had hesitated. Ethan stared at the check like it was written in a language he did not speak. "I can't take this." "You can," Victor said. "You will." The woman, Sarah, stepped forward. Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What do you want in return?" Victor looked at her, then back at Ethan. Nothing, but we're not done yet. He explained what they had found. Jazz had spent 72 hours digging through public records, cross-referencing hospital databases, and filing information requests. The picture that emerged was uglier than Victor had expected. Dr. Raymond Coulter, the man who had destroyed Ethan's career, was still chief of surgery at St. Vincent Hospital. In the 12 years since Ethan's resignation, 140 residents had left the program under similar circumstances. All had been pressured to resign after providing care to patients the hospital deemed unprofitable. Uninsured families, undocumented immigrants, addicts, the poor. Coulter's been doing this for over a decade, Victor said. And he's been getting paid for it. Leela Vargas stepped forward from the line of bikers. She had been standing near the back, arms crossed, waiting for her moment. Now she moved to Victor's side and looked directly at Ethan. I used to work at St. Vincent. I was an ER nurse under Coulter for 3 years. I watched him turn away patients who couldn't pay. I watched him bury complaints from staff who tried to push back. I left because I couldn't keep being part of it. Her voice was quiet, but carried weight. He's the reason I'm here now, instead of in a hospital where I belong. Ethan's face had gone pale. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to help us take him down, Victor said. And then you're going to take his job. For a long moment, no one spoke. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car drove past slowly, the driver craning his neck to stare at the rows of motorcycles. Ethan looked at the check in his hand, then at Victor, then at Sarah. I'm not a lawyer, Ethan said finally. I'm not an activist. I'm just a doctor trying to keep my head down and take care of my family. That's exactly why it has to be you, Victor said. Coulter destroyed you because you did the right thing. He's still there, still doing it. If you don't stop him, who will? Sarah's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. She looked at Victor, then at Leela, then at the 340 men standing silent in the street. And if we say no? Then we leave, Victor said simply. The money's yours either way. No strings, but you should know something. He pulled the photograph of Dimitri from his vest, the one showing him holding his grandson in the hospital bed 3 days before he died. He held it so both Ethan and Sarah could see. My brother got 10 extra years because your husband didn't look away. Ours he shouldn't have had. We're not asking you to risk your life. We're asking you to stand up while we stand beside you. Ethan took the photograph. His hands were steadier now. He studied the image for a long time, then handed it back. When he looked up, something in his expression had changed. The fear was still there, but it was smaller now, pushed aside by something harder. What do you need me to do? Victor allowed himself the smallest smile. First, you're going to tell us everything you remember about how Coulter operates. Then we're going to build a case. We've got 4 days before the hospital board meets to renew his contract. If we don't bury him by then, he's untouchable for another 5 years. Ethan nodded slowly. 4 days. 4 days, Victor confirmed. He extended his hand. Ethan hesitated, then took it. The handshake was firm, brief, and binding. Behind Victor, Wrench started his engine, then Jazz, then Old School. One by one, the motorcycles roared back to life, the sound rolling through the suburban street like a promise. Victor released Ethan's hand and stepped back. We'll be in touch, he said. And Doc, don't go to work today. You've got bigger things to do. Victor walked back to his bike, mounted, and pulled away. The convoy followed, peeling off in formation, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the faint vibration in the ground that lingered after they were gone. Ethan stood in his driveway holding the check, Sarah beside him, and watched until the last motorcycle disappeared around the corner. If this story moves you, subscribe and share it, because real-life heroes deserve to be remembered. Neighbors were already stepping into the street, talking in low voices, pulling up videos on their phones. Across the road, Mrs. Alvarez approached slowly, her dog pulling at the leash. Dr. Cross, are you all right? Should I call someone? Ethan looked down at the check again, then at Sarah. Her face was still pale, but she was nodding, just slightly. He looked back at Mrs. Alvarez and managed to smile. We're fine, he said. Everything's fine. But it was not fine, and he knew it. It was just beginning. The Iron Covenant clubhouse became a war room within hours of the convoy's return. The long wooden table was covered with documents, laptops, notepads filled with names and dates and connections drawn in thick black ink. Ethan sat at one end, still wearing the same clothes he had answered the door in that morning, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Across from him sat Diane Halstead, a civil rights attorney in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. Connor had brought her. They had worked together during a labor dispute in 2008, and she owed him a favor that had compounded interest over the years. Now she sat with Ethan's termination letter in front of her, reading it for the third time, her expression growing darker with each pass. "This is textbook wrongful termination," she said finally, "but the statute of limitations expired 10 years ago. We can't touch it directly." Ethan's shoulders sagged. "So that's it." "I didn't say that." Diane set the letter down and leaned forward. "We can't go after your termination, but if Coulter is still doing this, we can file a whistleblower case. The key is proving a pattern. One incident is a judgment call. 140 is institutional corruption." Jazz looked up from her laptop at the other end of the table. She had been working nonstop since the ride, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of speed that came from years of practice. "I've got the pattern. I pulled public records from the Oregon Medical Board, cross-referenced them with hospital employment databases, and matched them to resignation dates. 143 residents have left St. Vincent's surgical program in 12 years. The national average for a hospital that size is 32. Diane raised an eyebrows. "That's not just a pattern. That's a crisis." "It gets better," Jazz said. She turned her laptop so everyone could see the screen. It showed a spreadsheet with names, dates, and brief descriptions. "I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for any complaints filed against Coulter with the hospital or the medical board. Got 67 hits. All of them were dismissed or settled quietly. But the complaints tell a story." She scrolled down. Ethan leaned in to read. The words blurred together at first, then came into focus. "Refused to authorize care for uninsured patient. Pressured me to discharge patient who couldn't pay. Told me low-income patients were not worth the hospital's resources." The complaints spanned a decade, written by residents, nurses, attending physicians. All of them described the same man. "He's been doing this since before I got there," Ethan said quietly. "And he'll keep doing it, until someone stops him," Diane replied. She closed the laptop and looked at Victor, who had been standing near the wall, arms crossed, listening. "You said the hospital board meets in 4 days to renew his contract. If we want to stop that, we need more than documents. We need witnesses. People willing to go on record." Lila spoke up from her place near the window. "I can find them. I still know people at St. Vincent, nurses who've been there long enough to see what Coulter's really like. Some of them wanted to speak up years ago, but didn't have backup." "Then get them," Victor said. "We've got 72 hours. Lila nodded and pulled out her phone, already scrolling through contacts. She stepped outside and through the window. Ethan could see her pacing in the parking lot, her voice urgent but controlled. Jazz turned back to her laptop. "There's something else. I found financial records showing Coulter's been receiving consulting fees from GenMed Pharmaceuticals. $120,000 a year for the last 8 years. That's nearly $1 million. Diane's expression sharpened. "Consulting fees for what?" "That's the thing. There's no documentation of what the consulting involved. But GenMed's drugs are exclusively stocked at St. Vincent, even though there are cheaper alternatives available. If Coulter's taking money to push their products, that's fraud." "Can you prove the connection?" Diane asked. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." Victor pushed off from the wall and moved to the table. "What about people Coulter hurt? Patients who got turned away or families who lost someone because he prioritized money over care?" Diane hesitated. "That's harder. Medical malpractice cases are complicated, and if the patients were uninsured, they probably didn't pursue legal action. But if we can find even one case with clear documentation, it'll add weight to the whistleblower claim." "I'll find it," Jazz said. The room fell silent except for the clicking of Jazz's keyboard. Ethan stared at the documents spread across the table, at the names of residents who had been forced out just like him, at the complaints that had been buried, at the money Coulter had taken while people suffered. The anger he had buried for 12 years was rising now, hot and sharp, and he did not try to push it back down. Lila returned an hour later with a name. Dr. Rashid Okoye, a cardiologist who had been forced out of St. Vincent in 2018 after treating an undocumented patient who who arrived in the ER with a heart attack. Coulter had given him the same ultimatum Ethan had received: resign or face charges. Rashid had resigned. His visa had been tied to his employment, and losing the job had meant starting over in Seattle, rebuilding his career from scratch. "He'll testify," Lila said. "I just talked to him. He said he's been waiting for someone to go after Coulter for 6 years." Diane made a note. "Good. We'll need his statement in writing, notarized, by tomorrow." "I'll handle it," Lila said. Ethan looked at Victor. "What if this doesn't work? What if the board renews his contract anyway?" Victor met his gaze without hesitation. "Then we make sure the public knows what kind of man they're protecting. We make noise. We make it impossible for them to ignore." Ethan wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that 4 days and a group of bikers and a civil rights lawyer could take down a man who had spent 12 years operating with impunity. But the doubt was there, cold and familiar, whispering that people like Coulter always won because the system was built to protect them. Diane must have seen it on his face because she reached across the table and tapped the termination letter. "You saved a man's life and they punished you for it. That tells me everything I need to know about Raymond Coulter. Men like him count on people staying quiet. The moment you stop being quiet, they lose." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then let's make some noise." Jazz's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up, her expression grim. "We've got a problem. Someone just tipped off Coulter. He knows we're building a case." Victor's jaw tightened. "How?" "I don't know. But he just called Ethan's clinic. Left a message." She turned her phone around. The voicemail was already playing, Coulter's voice smooth and cold. "Dr. Cross, I heard you've been talking to some interesting people. I don't know what you think you're doing, but let me be very clear. You were finished in this city 12 years ago. If you keep pushing, I'll make sure you're finished everywhere else too. Walk away now, and we'll forget this ever happened." The message ended. The room was silent. Ethan stood. His hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in years. He looked at Victor, then at Diane, then at the faces of the men and women who had spent the last 6 hours fighting for him. "I'm not walking away." Victor smiled, slow and dangerous. "Good, neither are we." The protest began at dawn on the 3rd day. 30 members of the Iron Covenant arrived outside St. Vincent Hospital at 5:45 in the morning, parking their motorcycles in neat rows along the public sidewalk. They carried no weapons, made no threats, simply stood in formation with signs printed the night before at a copy shop in southeast Portland. The signs were simple, black text on white poster board: "Doctors should heal, not abandon. Fire Coulter. Save lives. How many more will he silence?" Victor had planned the shifts carefully. 30 bikers followed. Or 4 hours, then a rotation. Fresh faces, fresh energy, constant presence. The message was clear: we are not leaving until this is finished. By 7 in the morning, the first news van arrived. By 8, there were 3. Reporters approached cautiously, cameras rolling, asking questions that Victor answered with the same calm precision he had used at Ethan's front door. "We're here because Dr. Raymond Coulter has spent 12 years forcing good doctors out of this hospital for caring about patients more than profit. We have documentation, we have witnesses, and we're not going away until the board hears the truth." The footage aired on the noon news. By 2 in the afternoon, it had been picked up by local stations across Oregon. By evening, it was trending on social media. Jazz had been ready. She launched the campaign from her laptop in the clubhouse, fingers flying across the keyboard, building a website in under 3 hours. The domain was simple: coulterfiles.org. The content was devastating. She uploaded redacted documents showing the 143 resignations, the buried complaints, the financial records linking Coulter to GenMed Pharmaceuticals. She posted video testimonials. Dr. Rashid Okoye spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady and exhausted. "I took an oath to do no harm. Raymond Coulter took an oath to protect his bottom line. I was forced to choose between my career and my conscience. I chose conscience. He chose money." Lila had found others. A nurse named Sandra Pritchard, who had worked in the surgical unit for 15 years before quitting in frustration. An attending physician named Marcus Lowe, who had left St. Vincent in 2016 after Coulter overruled his decision to treat a homeless man with sepsis. Each of them spoke on camera, their faces exhausted but resolute. The videos were short, no more than 2 minutes each, and they spread like wildfire. Within 6 hours, the hashtag Coulter Files had been used 40,000 times. Within 12 hours, the count was over 200,000. News outlets began calling the hospital for comment. The administration released a statement. St. Vincent Hospital is committed to providing excellent care to all patients. Dr. Coulter has served with distinction for many years, and we stand by his record. The statement lasted less than a day before the first crack appeared. A current resident at St. Vincent, a 26-year-old woman named Amy Tran, recorded herself in a hospital stairwell during a rare break. Her eyes were red, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm a doctor. I took an oath to heal people. But every single day, I'm told to choose between that oath and my job. I can't keep turning people away because they can't pay. I can't keep pretending this is normal. Someone has to say it out loud. This is wrong." She posted the video anonymously at 11 at night. By 2 in the morning, it had been viewed 2.3 million times. By dawn, the number had doubled. The hospital's public relations team scrambled to respond, but the damage was done. Amy Tran's face was everywhere, and her message was simple enough that no amount of corporate language could bury it. On the 4th day, Raymond Coulter made his first public appearance. He agreed to an interview with a local news station, sitting in his office at St. Vincent, composed and calm in a tailored suit. The reporter asked careful questions about the allegations, the financial records, the forced resignations. Coulter answered each one with the smooth confidence of a man who had never been held accountable for anything. "These are disgruntled former employees making baseless accusations. I've dedicated my career to this hospital and to excellent patient care. The idea that I would prioritize profit over people is absurd." The reporter pressed, "Doctor, can you address the financial records showing payments from GenMed Pharmaceuticals?" Coulter's expression did not change. "Those payments were disclosed to the hospital and are entirely legal. I provided consulting services. There's nothing improper about that. Can you tell us what those consulting services involved?" For the first time, Coulter hesitated. It was barely a second, just a flicker of uncertainty, but the camera caught it. "That's proprietary information." The reporter leaned forward. "Dr. Coulter, over 100 residents have left your program in 12 years. That's 4 times the national average. How do you explain that?" Coulter stood abruptly. "This interview is over." He walked off camera. The clip aired that evening and went viral within an hour. 5 million views by midnight. The image of Coulter walking away, his composure finally cracking, became the symbol of everything the campaign represented. A man who had operated in shadows for years, now exposed and fleeing from questions he could not answer. The Iron Covenant maintained their vigil outside the hospital. The rotating shifts continued, 30 bikers at all times, silent and immovable. Nurses began bringing them coffee in the mornings. A group of medical students joined the protest on the 3rd afternoon, holding their own signs. Several wore purple ribbons pinned to their scrubs. A silent show of solidarity that sped through the hospital staff like a quiet rebellion. On the evening of the 4th day, Coulter's legal team filed for a restraining order against the Iron Covenant and Ethan Cross, claiming harassment and intimidation. The hearing was set for 9 the following morning, 1 day before the hospital board meeting. Diane Halstead received the notification at 7 in the evening and called Victor immediately. "They're trying to shut us down before the board meets. If the judge grants the restraining order, you'll have to pull back, and Ethan won't be able to present evidence." Victor's voice was calm. "Will the judge grant it?" "Depends on the judge. It's Carol Brennan. She's fair, but she's by the book. If Coulter's lawyer can argue credible intimidation, she might side with him. Then we make sure there's nothing to argue." The hearing took place in a small courtroom downtown. Coulter's lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s named Preston Walsh, presented his case with polished confidence. He showed photos of the bikers outside the hospital, cited complaints from staff members who felt unsafe, argued that the presence of a motorcycle club constituted intimidation regardless of intent. Diane stood and responded without notes. "Your Honor, the Iron Covenant filed a legal permit for their demonstration. They have not blocked access to the hospital, threatened staff, or violated any ordinance. What Mr. Walsh is calling intimidation is actually protected speech. His client is uncomfortable because he's being held accountable, not because anyone has threatened him. She presented her own evidence, statements from hospital staff thanking the bikers for their presence, security footage showing bikers helping an elderly patient carry groceries to her car, a letter from a nurse named Sandra Pritchard praising their professionalism. Judge Brennan reviewed the documents in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up. "Mr. Walsh, I'm denying the restraining order. I see no evidence of harassment or intimidation. What I do see is a group exercising their First Amendment rights in a lawful manner." She glanced at Diane. "However, if any party engages in conduct that crosses the line into harassment, I will revisit this decision immediately. Am I clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Diane said. Coulter's face had gone pale. He stood and walked toward the exit, his lawyer following. As he pushed through the courtroom doors, a nurse in purple scrubs stepped forward and handed him an envelope. Cameras outside captured the moment. Inside the envelope was a resignation letter, signed by Sandra Pritchard and 6 other surgical nurses. The footage aired that night. By morning, it had been viewed 8 million times. The St. Vincent Hospital boardroom sat on the 12th floor, a sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a long glass table that reflected the faces of the 7 people seated around it. At the head sat Margaret Voss, the hospital's chief executive officer, a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of composure that came from years of managing crises. To her left sat Raymond Coulter, wearing a dark suit and an expression that suggested he had already won. The meeting was scheduled for 6 in the evening, after regular business hours, away from the eyes of staff and patients. But 200 bikers stood in the parking lot below, their presence impossible to ignore. News vans lined the street. Reporters waited outside the main entrance. This was no longer a private matter. Margaret called the meeting to order at 6:03. Her voice was calm, businesslike, designed to convey control. "We're here to discuss Dr. Coulter's contract renewal. Dr. Coulter, you have the floor." Coulter stood. He placed a folder on the table and opened it with deliberate care, revealing charts and graphs printed on glossy paper. Revenue projections, efficiency metrics, patient throughput statistics. He spoke for 12 minutes, his tone confident. His argument built on numbers that showed St. Vincent's surgical program had become 40% more profitable under his leadership. "These results speak for themselves," he said. "We've streamlined operations, reduced waste, and improved our financial standing. The complaints being circulated are from disgruntled former employees who couldn't meet the standards we set. I've served this hospital with integrity for over a decade, and I'm prepared to continue doing so." He sat down. The board members glanced at one another, at the charts, at Margaret. One of them, a man in his 60s named Thomas Kemp, nodded slightly. It looked like a done deal. Then Diane Halstead stood from her seat near the back of the room. She had entered quietly 10 minutes earlier, her presence noted but not challenged. Now she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence with precision. "Madam CEO, my name is Diane Halstead. I'm an attorney representing Dr. Ethan Cross and several former employees of this hospital. Under Oregon's whistleblower statute, my client has the legal right to present evidence relevant to this proceeding. I'm invoking that right now." Margaret's expression. Session tightened, but she did not hesitate. "You have 15 minutes. Diane nodded and gestured toward the door. Ethan entered, followed by Victor, Lila, and Dr. Rashid Okoye. They moved to the front of the room and stood in a line facing the board. Ethan's hands were steady. He had not slept more than 3 hours in the past 4 days, but his mind was clear. Diane placed a tablet on the table and connected it to the boardroom's display screen. A document appeared. A timeline showing 143 resignations from the surgical residency program over 12 years. National average for comparison, 32. "This is not normal turnover," Diane said. "This is systemic." As one of these residents left under pressure after providing care to patients Dr. Coulter deemed unprofitable. Uninsured families, immigrants, addicts, people who needed help and were turned away because helping them didn't improve your bottom line. She advanced the slide, complaint after complaint, redacted to protect identities but clear in their content. refused to authorize surgery for uninsured patient, told me low-income cases were bad for hospital metrics, threatened my position after I treated a homeless man. Coulter leaned forward, his voice sharp. These are anonymous complaints with no verification. They prove nothing. Then let's talk about what we can verify, Diane said. She displayed financial records showing payments from GenMed Pharmaceuticals to Coulter. $1.2 million over 8 years, consulting fees with no documentation of services provided. During that same period, GenMed's drugs became exclusively stocked at this hospital, despite cheaper alternatives being available. That's not consulting. That's a kickback. Coulter's lawyer started to object, but Margaret raised a hand. Let her finish. Diane turned to Ethan. Doctor Cross, tell the board what happened to you. Ethan stepped forward. His voice was quiet but steady. 12 years ago, I stopped on the side of Highway 26 to save a man who was dying. I performed an emergency procedure that kept him alive until paramedics arrived. I was late to my first day as a resident because of it. Dr. Coulter gave me a choice: resign quietly or be reported for unauthorized intervention. I resigned. The man I saved lived another 10 years. I lost my career for doing what I was trained to do. One of the board members, an older woman named Dr. Helen Ng, leaned forward. She had been a practicing physician for 30 years before joining the board, and her eyes were sharp. Raymond, is this true? Coulter's expression did not change. Dr. Cross made a decision that exposed this hospital to liability. I acted in the institution's best interest. You acted to protect your reputation, Ethan said. And you've been doing it ever since. How many residents have you forced out? How many patients were turned away because they couldn't pay? How many people died waiting for approval that never came? This is slander, Coulter said, his voice rising for the first time. Diane held up a hand. Then explain this. She played an audio recording on the screen. The sound quality was clear, the voice unmistakable. Coulter's voice. If they can't pay, send them to county. We're not a charity. I don't care what the resident thinks. The recording was dated 5 days earlier. The context, provided in a written transcript on the screen, was a conversation about a 7-year-old child with bacterial meningitis whose parents were uninsured. The child had eventually been treated at the county hospital, but not before suffering permanent hearing loss. The room was silent. Coulter stared at the screen, his face pale. Where did you get that? It was provided through the hospital's whistleblower hotline, Diane said, legally obtained and fully admissible. Margaret Voss closed the folder in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice carried weight. Dr. Coulter, this board has a fiduciary responsibility to this hospital, but we also have an ethical one. What I'm hearing suggests a pattern of conduct that violates both. Thomas Kemp, the board member who had nodded earlier, spoke up. Margaret, we need to consider the financial impact. Coulter's leadership has been profitable. Dr. Helen Ng turned to face him. At what cost, Thomas? How many lives? How many careers? She looked back at Coulter. Raymond, I've known you for 20 years. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you take money from GenMed Pharmaceuticals in exchange for stocking their drugs exclusively? Coulter met her gaze. The payments were disclosed. They're legal. That's not what I asked. Silence stretched. Coulter's jaw tightened. This meeting is over. He stood and moved toward the door. Before he reached it, Jazz entered, moving quickly, her laptop open in her hands. She did not wait for permission to speak. You need to see this. She set the laptop on the table and turned it so the board could see. On the screen was an email chain, recovered through a Freedom of Information request filed with the State Pharmacy Board. The emails showed correspondence between Coulter and a GenMed executive discussing patients. Ent volume projections, drug pricing negotiations, and a phrase that appeared 3 times, competitive advantage through exclusive partnership. Margaret Voss read the emails in silence. When she looked up, her expression had hardened into something final. Dr. Coulter, your contract will not be renewed. Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave pending a full investigation by the State Medical Board. Coulter's face twisted. You'll regret this. All of you. No, Margaret said quietly. I regret not doing it sooner. Coulter turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a sound like a gavel. The board members sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room like ash. Finally, Dr. Helen Ng looked at Ethan. "Dr. Cross, this hospital owes you an apology. And more than that, it owes you a chance to finish what was taken from you." Ethan did not know what to say, so he simply nodded. Outside, 200 bikers waited in the parking lot, engines silent, arms crossed. When Victor's phone buzzed with a message from Diane, he read it, then raised his fist in the air. The sound that followed was not engines roaring, but hands clapping, a wave of applause that rolled through the crowd and echoed off the hospital walls. 3 months later, the nameplate on the door read, "Dr. Ethan Cross, Interim Chief of Surgery." The office was smaller than Coulter's had been, tucked into a corner of the 4th floor with a window that overlooked the staff parking lot instead of the city. Ethan had chosen it deliberately. He did not need the view. He needed to be close to the residents, close to the work, close to the people who mattered. He sat at his desk reviewing applications for the residency program. There were 42 of them, more than St. Vincent had received in 5 years. Word had spread quickly after Coulter's removal. The hospital that had once been known for driving out idealistic young doctors was now being rebuilt by one. Ethan read each application carefully, looking for the ones who wrote about patience instead of prestige, about care instead of career advancement. A knock interrupted him. Amy Tran stood in the doorway, still wearing her scrubs, her face tired but no longer afraid. "Dr. Cross, we have a walk-in. Uninsured. Kidney stone. Looks bad. Do you want me to send them to county?" Ethan looked up. The question was a test, though Amy probably did not realize it. He had made his policy clear on his first day, but old habits died hard, and the residents were still learning to trust that the rules had actually changed. "No," Ethan said. "Prep a room. I'll be down in 5 minutes." Amy nodded, and something like relief crossed her face. "Thank you." She left. Ethan stood and pulled on his white coat. The one that still felt strange after 12 years of working in a walk-in clinic where no one wore them. He had not expected to be back in a hospital, much less running a department. But here he was, and the weight of it felt right, in a way nothing else had in a long time. The Dmitry Konstantin Memorial Clinic opened on a cold Saturday in late September. The building sat on a corner lot in North Portland. A former auto repair shop that Wrench and a crew of Iron Covenant members had spent 6 weeks converting into something that looked almost professional. The waiting room had mismatched chairs donated by a church and magazines that were only 2 months out of date. The exam rooms were small but clean, outfitted with equipment purchased through donations that had poured in after the Coulter story went national. The funding had come from everywhere. The Iron Covenant's initial fundraiser brought in $340,000, $1,000 for every bike that had ridden to Ethan's house that morning. Medical suppliers who had watched the news coverage donated equipment. A retired pediatrician in Seattle said $10,000 with a note that said, "This is what medicine should look like." A hospital settlement with former residents who had been wrongfully forced out created a victim relief fund that contributed another $500,000. Ethan worked at the clinic 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, the days he was not needed at St. Vincent. Leela ran the nursing staff, a team of 3 former hospital nurses who had left their jobs in protest and found a new home here. Rashid Okoye volunteered every Saturday, driving down from Seattle to see patients who could not afford a cardiologist anywhere else. On opening day, 40 people showed up before the doors even unlocked. Families with children who had been turned away from other clinics. Immigrants who spoke little English but understood that this place would not ask for their papers before asking about their pain. A man in his 70s with diabetes who had been rationing his insulin because he could not afford the prescriptions his doctor ordered. Ethan saw them all, one after another. No one turned away. No one asked to pay up front. At the end of the day, he sat in the small office that doubled as a supply closet and looked at the intake forms. 40 patients. 40 people who had walked through the door afraid they would be sent away and walked out W blank. If care. It was not enough to fix the system, but it was enough to matter. Victor stopped by that evening after the last patient left. He found Ethan sitting in the waiting room, staring at the empty chairs. Victor did not say anything, just sat down beside him and waited. "He used to say good people always circle back," Ethan said finally. "Dimitri, that's what you told me." "He did say that. It took 12 years. Victor nodded. "Some debts take time. Doesn't make them worth less." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the sound of motorcycles idling in the parking lot was steady and familiar. The Iron Covenant had assigned rotating security shifts to the clinic, 2 members on site at all times during operating hours. Not because there had been trouble, but because they wanted to make sure there never would be. Sarah gave birth 6 weeks later at St. Vincent Hospital. The delivery was attended by Dr. Lena Ortiz, Ethan's old mentor who had fought for him 12 years ago and returned to the hospital as an advisory board member after Coulter's removal. The labor lasted 14 hours, and when it was over, Ethan held his daughter in his arms and could not find words for what he felt. They named her Anya, after Dimitri's mother. Victor had suggested it quietly one evening, and Sarah had agreed without hesitation. It felt right. A life saved had led to this life beginning, and the circle closed in a way that made sense only if you believed in debts that outlasted death. Victor and 12 other members of the Iron Covenant waited in a family lounge during the delivery. The nurses brought them coffee and smiled when they saw the leather vests. One of them, an older woman named Patricia, had been part of the protest outside the hospital. She shook Victor's hand and said, "You all changed this place. Don't think we've forgotten." When Ethan finally emerged, exhausted and grinning, Victor stood and embraced him. "Dimitri would have liked this," he said quietly. "He would have liked knowing his name lives on." "It does," Ethan said, "in more ways than one." Raymond Coulter's medical license was revoked 4 months after the board meeting. The state investigation uncovered financial irregularities that went beyond the GenMed payments, including falsified patient care records and billing fraud that had been ongoing for years. He faced charges that would likely result in prison time, though his lawyers were fighting to delay the trial. Ethan did not follow the case closely. He had said what he needed to say, and the rest was no longer his concern. On a cold evening in December, Ethan stood in front of Dimitri Konstantin's grave, in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Portland. The headstone was simple. Black granite with his name and dates and a single line underneath. "He roamed with honor." Ethan placed a photograph on the stone, a picture of the clinic's opening day. 40 people waiting outside in the rain because they knew someone would finally help them. Victor appeared beside him, hands in his pockets, breath misting in the cold air. "He'd be proud, you know. Not just of the clinic, of you. I didn't do this alone. No, but you started it. That day on the highway. You could have kept driving. You didn't." Ethan looked at the photograph, at the faces of people who had been invisible to the system, until someone decided they mattered. "He lived 10 extra years because I stopped. I got a second chance because you came back. I don't know how to measure that kind of debt." "You don't measure it," Victor said. "You live it." They stood in silence as the light faded and the temperature dropped. Finally, Victor turned to leave, then paused. "You know we're still doing security at the clinic, right? Every night. Not because you asked, because some things are worth protecting." "I know," Ethan said, "and I'm grateful." Victor nodded and walked back toward his bike. Ethan stayed a moment longer, then followed. The sound of engines starting echoed through the cemetery, a low rumble that faded into the distance as the Iron Covenant rode out into the evening. The clinic remained open 6 days a week. In its first year, it served over 2,000 patients. Ethan continued working at St. Vincent 3 days a week, rebuilding the residency program into something that prioritized compassion over efficiency. Amy Tran stayed on and became chief resident 2 years later. Lila extended the clinic's nursing staff to 7. Rashida Koi eventually moved back to Portland and joined full-time. The Iron Covenant still patrols the clinic every night, not because they have to. Because some brotherhoods are born in blood, and some in gratitude that never dies. Ethan Cross gave up his dream to save a stranger. 12 years later, 340 strangers gave him a new one. Not all debts are paid in cash. Some are paid in changed lives, second chances, and promises kept long after the grave. Dr. Ethan Cross still works at St. Vincent Hospital, and runs the Dmitry Konstantin Memorial Clinic. Dr. Raymond Coulter's medical license was permanently revoked in 2024. The Iron Covenant Motorcycle Club has since raised over $2 million for medical debt relief in Oregon.